Gorman Faculty Lounge.
To the first session or two this morning.
All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming to our second panel today, The Promise of Classical Education. I'm Philip Harold. I'm the Dean of the Constantine College of Liberal Arts here at the University of Dallas. And it's my pleasure to moderate the panel. We'll start with introductions and then give the panelists 18, 20 minutes and have a half hour for questions at the end. So first, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Mitch Rocklin, who serves as academic director and dean of the Lobel Center for Jewish Classical Education. A scholar of Jewish thought and classical education, he has contributed extensively to the renewal of Jewish liberal arts learning, emphasizing the integration of classical texts with Jewish intellectual tradition. His work spans curriculum development, teacher training, and scholarship on the philosophical and theological foundations of education. And then Dr. Erik Ellis is Assistant Professor of Education and Classical Learning at the University of Dallas. His teaching and research focus is on the philosophy of education, classical pedagogy, and the recovery of the liberal arts tradition within contemporary schooling, and he's working on a book on the history of classical education. Dr. R.J. Snell is Director of Academic Programs and Editor-in-Chief of Public Discourse at the Witherspoon Institute. A philosopher and theologian by training, his work addresses moral philosophy, virtue ethics, natural law, and the intersection of religion and public life. Dr. Snell has written widely on culture, higher education, and the intellectual challenges facing contemporary society. Dr. Josh Parens is professor of philosophy at the University of Dallas and a leading scholar of medieval political philosophy and Jewish thought. His research explores figures such as Maimonides and Al-Farabi, with particular attention to the relationship between philosophy, religion, and politics. He's the author and editor of multiple books and articles examining the tensions and complementarities of rational inquiry and religious tradition. And finally, Dr. Mark Goodwin is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Theology at the University of Dallas. And over a long academic career, he has written and taught on Christian theology, biblical studies, and the intellectual tradition of the church. Dr. Goodwin is widely recognized for his contributions to theological education and for mentoring generations of students in the liberal arts and theological disciplines. Let's welcome our panelists and thank them for coming. We start with you. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So I was told 15 minutes, so I have more time to talk now. No, but I'll try to keep it on the short side, but more time for questions. You know, the theme that I worked out to speak about is how classical education can bring Christians and Jews closer together. So we just had a gold medal winning hockey game where we had a player with a Jewish mother and a Catholic father who runs a literacy program in New Jersey, the book he brought to the gold medal game was The Odyssey. So we're doing it already in more ways than one. I'm not sure what I really have to add, but I think we're on the right track. But as far as the broader theme of saving Western civilization one student at a time, I think we have to ask the question, what is the West? What is it that we're saving when we think about all the saving that we're doing with all of these students? And to put it very simply, the West, I think, can be defined as Greco-Roman culture re-examined through a Jewish lens. or transfigured through a Jewish lens. It's an easy way to put it. And most of the West, of course, is what we would call Christendom. And that's what's happening in Christendom. We have the Greeks and the Romans to thank for all of the disciplines that were created. Certainly as we understand them, obviously they're not the only ones to work in the realms of the disciplines that we understand, but the disciplines that we understand are, of course, Greek and Roman. But the imperative to go ahead and engage in these disciplines is not Greek or Roman. At least it's insufficient if you're working in a Greek or Roman context. Without a covenantal understanding, without the notion that human beings are not only close to God, but actually live in such a way that God is essentially dependent upon human beings. That's the language that is present throughout the Hebrew Bible. The way in which God is described as relating to human beings is most often not as a master to a servant, but much more often using other metaphors that are much more loving. And so in the same way that a parent is dependent upon a child for the parent's very existence as a parent, so too is God tied up with humanity. And that's what it means to be the God of covenant, as opposed to either a pagan god, say a Canaanite god, or say the God of Aristotle, who's not in covenant with human beings, who's not dependent upon human beings in any way, shape, or form, in the same way that a human parent is dependent upon a child. A human child might be much weaker than a human parent, but nobody would argue that the parent would be just the same if he would just go ahead and, say, kill his child out of dissatisfaction or whatever the case may be. Or if, God forbid, the child were to be lost for some reason, that parent's existence would no longer be the same. And so the parent really is truly dependent. Now, what that means to have this kind of dependent relationship is that human beings are really responsible for living well as human beings. It's not just that they can live well and that they ought to do so if they find that they're capable of being better than other people around them, but rather they must. And they must. All human beings are responsible for living well as human beings. There's no way to divide people into categories in which some are superior to others, some are inferior to others, some are fit to be masters, some are fit to be mistresses, some are fit to be slaves or maidservants. That's not how things ought to be. And as we see in biblical literature, you can see the development of a culture that is the foundation of freedom that would only be realized centuries and centuries later in opposition to slavery on principle, but which really isn't possible without a covenantal outlook on the relationship between God and humanity. So the West then depends upon two things. It depends on the Greco-Roman culture that is the foundation of learning in the sense of what it means to live well as a human being, and it depends upon the imperative to live well as a human being, which really comes from the biblical notion of covenant, which is really what sets apart the Hebrews and the Jewish people from others at the time, and that allows the West to be built as we know it. So liberal education then, or classical education, whatever we want to call it, I use the term synonymously for our purposes, is really about teaching people how they can be free. But in the context of a mature West, of course, it became not only teaching people how they can live as free human beings, but teaching them that they must live as free human beings. They ought to do so, not simply because it's a better way of life, but because it's as if God is depending on them to do so. In the same way that a parent is dependent upon the choices that his or her child makes for his or her own happiness. How can we be happy as a parent if our child rebels against us, goes ahead and lives a life that is terrible for them, that causes suffering for them? We then suffer. And there's a whole corpus of Jewish midrashic texts commenting on God's relationship with human beings based on biblical motifs and metaphors and taking them very seriously. For example, one of my favorite, that God cries for the fate of human beings when they're suffering and says, woe unto me, for my people have rebelled against me, but what am I to do? For I've made them, and so I must bear them. And quoting the verse in Isaiah, until old age I am he, and until hoary old age I will bear. I have made and I will carry, and I will essentially, I will redeem and save. In other words, God is stuck with us. There's nothing that he can do. He's stuck with free human beings. So if we're going to be responsible as we ought to be as human beings, we need to learn to live well as free human beings who are going to make God proud. And all of this language that I'm using is poetic for a reason. I think that when we think about classical education, we need to first understand the poetic basis of what it is to be an educated person, and that really starts in childhood. If we don't have a poetic foundation for education, we are really not going to be able to be good philosophers at the end of the day, or we'll become stunted philosophers. We'll become the kinds of philosophers who produce what Hans Christian Andersen describes in The Shadow as the one who doesn't appreciate poetry, the one who essentially uses calculations to attempt. Jonathan Swift warned about this in Gulliver's Travels long before. The one who thinks that all things can be solved through calculations, all things can be solved through sharp thinking, and essentially what we end up with is nothing, really. We end up with a dehumanized existence that involves nothing of the poetry that used to serve as the foundation for thought itself. So if we have a liberal education or a classical education, well, then what we're really seeking to do is to teach people how to live well as human beings and how they must live well as human beings, or else existence itself is just not worth having. So what happened? Well, we had university education for the longest time. Things were not well, as I think we should always remember. I think sometimes we romanticize and fantasize about how we think up a vision of how things were in the past that was supposedly so great. Of course, it wasn't, as anyone who's read, say, for example, 19th century novels knows, the kinds of brutality that were to be found in classrooms that Charles Dickens describes. And Dickens isn't making this up. You have parliamentary commissions exploring horrible things going on in Britain in the 19th century. We're dealing with a whole series of problems that progressive education rises to deal with, and understandably so. And one thing that modernity teaches us, which I think we often forget because traditionalists are often afraid of modernity. We see the wreckage that it's created, and it's created a great deal of wreckage, but that causes us to sometimes reject the entire project, and we throw out the baby with the bathwater. We forget sometimes the lesson many of the lessons that we need to learn from it. And in the last panel, we talked about Stoicism versus a biblical outlook, but actually, I really like Jacques Barzun's formulation, which is that the alternative is not Stoicism, certainly not modernity, but it's a form of hedonism that we're dealing with. And that form of hedonism has actually been highly productive. Neo-hedonism, we might call it, the way Barzun describes it, a revitalization of hedonism, but in a new context. But it's easy to just dismiss that and poo-poo it and say, oh, okay, well, that's created a lot of destruction. In the same way that we can easily dismiss modern individualism and say, oh, well, that's destroyed communities and created a whole host of problems. Well, actually, it's created a whole host of wonderful accomplishments as well. So, for example, in the past, the university wasn't open to all who lived in the community where the university was. It was a closed enterprise. Jews were not allowed into universities for centuries, with some exceptions, Renaissance Italy, etc. But what modernity does is it serves as a wake-up call to allow us to appreciate the value of lived, embodied human existence. And it points to the fact that if we don't live well as human beings in all respects, then we're failing to do something intrinsically significant. There's no life of the spirit that we can retreat to and then simply ignore our physical existence. I use the word physical loosely. I hate using the word. Our embodied existence, that what we actually do as human beings, the way we live, body and soul, completely unified. We need to be reminded that that existence is real and intrinsically significant, and that human suffering really matters. And so if the price of older modes of education was that children would suffer in school, supposedly for their benefit in the long run, but truly suffer in brutal manners, then that education was called into question. The justice of that education was called into question. And that's one thing that led, among many other factors, to progressive education as we know it. So hopefully we've redeemed education in that regard, right? We don't use corporal punishment. We don't cause children to suffer terribly. We want education to be enjoyable. That doesn't necessarily mean fun, but we want it to be enjoyable and not something that involves terrible suffering. But what that means also is that we have to consider what it is that we want to do better on substantive grounds, because it's not simply the case that we can go back to the old way things were done on substance and bring those back as long as we've ameliorated the problems that are what we might call physical, say, or embodied problems. There's something that is lacking in classical education as an antidote to our problems. What we've gotten right is we've looked back to the past and we've said we've lost memorization, we've lost the notion that you need knowledge as a basis upon which to think. We've lost the notion that everyone should, to the extent they're capable of doing so, think for themselves. We've lost numerous notions that we could go back to. I'm not going to go through all of them, but essentially what we find ourselves doing is rectifying this, and we've done a very good job in many respects. And classical education is extraordinarily promising, as the title of this panel implies. And I think that here at the University of Dallas, we're working on it with gusto and with a lot of energy, and it's wonderful to be a part of it here. But there are things that we can do better, and there are things that we can do differently, and those will actually serve to, I think, bring Christians and Jews together behind a shared enterprise that involves a renewed appreciation of a shared civilization. Essentially, what we have the power to do is create a better world of education and a better civilization, one that we wish we had been living in until now. It's very easy to go backwards and to look at persecution and difficulties and strife and to fixate on them. It's a lot harder to say, we wish things hadn't been that way. Here's a better way of doing things. Here's a better way of living, and this is how we should move forward. And that's one of the problems that modernity answered, but secular modernity failed to provide an adequate answer to these problems, and that's one thing that we're struggling with now. As we seek to recover an education that accounts for the need for religion in addition to the need for humanism, really both. Leo Strauss famously wrote that he wasn't sure if liberal education could survive in the long run without religion. My father-in-law likes to add, it's not a question of not sure, it definitely cannot last in the long run without religion. I agree, I don't think it can. But in doing so, we have to think about how we can remedy the problems that got us to some dark times in our history. And I think that one of the problems that got us to dark places in the course of our history is the fragmentation of our civilization. And that's what I want to finish my remarks by talking about. Ever since Alexander the Great, and certainly we could pick a time, but it's certainly at some point it became a misnomer to talk about anything like a separated Jewish civilization, something that existed outside of the context of a broader Western civilization. In the same way that we can't talk about, say, Plato and Aristotle outside of what we would call a Western civilization, we can't talk about a Christendom outside of what we would call a Western civilization. The same thing is true with respect to Judaism. It's just not separable from the West from the West in general, from the rest of Western civilization. But efforts were made to try to break them apart, to try to talk about Christianity as an independent religion that doesn't have Jewish roots. Obviously, that can be acknowledged as Jewish roots, but that isn't deemed significant on account of those Jewish roots. And you see this all over the place. One classical text I was reading is written a number of decades ago. Christianity begins, the history of Christianity starts, and there is nothing before. Meaning it's just Roman history, and then boom, Christianity comes onto the scene. There is nothing to account for the Judaism of Jesus. There's nothing to account for the Pharisaic Judaism of Jesus, nothing to account for what it is that he's doing, the language that he's using, the goals that he has, so on and so forth. Anything that ought to be obvious if we're taking a broader context into consideration. So the opposite can also be true. In response to persecution, in response to being sort of written out of the civilization, Jews have had a tendency to characterize themselves as independent of that civilization and as capable of existing outside of it. one of the biggest myths that was created in response to this brutal persecution was a 19th century myth, largely crafted by German Jewish academics, which is that essentially Islamic civilization was just better for the Jews. And essentially it was an attempt to write a history that was more promising, that was brighter. Now, of course, it's not really true. You can find places, it leads to this odd calculus of attempting to sort of calculate suffering over lands and time and spaces, which doesn't really make any sense. You can always, of course, say, well, you know, you have Spain in these years, but not those years, and that's far better, so on and so forth. But what you end up with is a situation where many Jews decide we're going to batten down the hatches, we're going to isolate, we're going to study our own culture, our own civilization, seen as a separate civilization. It's an error. It's a great error because the contribution that Judaism made to the formation of Western civilization is incalculably important. Without it, there is no West as we know it. So in a variety of ways, we can learn together and study together in the same way that it should be obvious that Jews ought to study the broader West. It should also be obvious that any classical educational endeavor that's attempting to recover our civilization in a way that appreciates all of its goodness should appreciate the roots of that civilization in Judaism. That doesn't mean that the Greeks and the Romans didn't invent all our disciplines. They did, but the roots of the imperative to live well as a human being, qua human being. There are areas where we could do this, many. One is biblical literacy. So, for example, it's difficult to read the book of Matthew and come across or come away with the conclusion that Jesus is writing outside of or is acting outside of a Jewish context and particularly outside of a Pharisaic context. Anybody who's read the Old Testament, anybody who's read the Hebrew Bible in depth can understand the references, not only in terms of references that are being made in terms of words, but also emotional references, the way of speaking, the way that rebukes are put forward. And that context is extremely important because it's easy to sort of make the argument, well, there's a break that's being created here between the roots of Christianity and a new type of religion. And that's really not what's going on. A Christianity that's separated from its roots, that doesn't understand its origins, and that doesn't understand the poetic basis for its existence, is going to find itself in a great deal of trouble. It's going to create a very dark situation in which essentially the temptation to live free from biblical understandings of the human being are going to be tempting, and pagan understandings can creep in very, very easily. But in addition to understanding origins, biblical literacy, origins of Christianity, there's also a need to understand the role that living Jewish texts have played in Western civilization and the ebb and flow that has been university life and classical education. So in the 12th century in university life, you could find debate, peaceful debate between Jews and Christians concerning biblical interpretation, interpretive modes that are important for understanding the development of Protestant Reformation later on, but also the development of different ways of looking at biblical texts and even law in early modernity in particular. Midrash, like the language of Hebrew, tends to make an ebb and flow return in the context of Western education. But also, there's a real need to understand the continuity of a tradition that never really disappeared. Jews were exiled and lived abroad, but maintained the desire to return home, maintained the desire to resurrect Jewish life in the Holy Land, a Jerusalem and a Zion that would be not simply allegorical, but very much real. And the yearning for the return to something real is part and parcel of what allowed for an understanding that lived existence, embodied existence remains important. You cannot allegorize the most important things in life. They have to be lived. And it's an ever-present temptation to write them off as something that just it can be talked about in thought. But George Eliot's Daniel Deronda is perhaps the best treatment of this issue, showing how the Jewish tenacity to continue the tradition of covenantal life and ritualized covenantal life is essential to our understanding, to understanding what it is that we ought to do as human beings here on this earth. And it's part of what led to the revitalization of the West in modern times, and in a way that allowed for so much to be done productively by resurrecting other traditions that served as the basis of the West. So I think that we find ourselves at a crossroads. And as we look back at the accomplishments that classical education has made, we really have two possibilities. One is we can be satisfied with what it is that we've done, or the other is we can seek to improve what we've done. And the rounding out of what we've accomplished, I think, would be to add Jerusalem to the mixture that is Athens and Rome that has done so well thus far, but really to round out who we are as human beings, not only in terms of what we've accomplished and how we can live, but how we ought to live as human beings, and to take on the responsibility that we have to live well, no matter who we are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Dr. Ellis.
So I begin this by saying no one has ever really been able to figure out what I am. When I go to an academic conference, they wonder if I'm a classicist or a historian or a philosopher. And I describe myself as a humanist because I'm not sure what I am, but I'm something between an intellectual historian and a classicist who, for whatever reason, in the divine providence, often has to teach philosophy. So one of the things that I make a habit of is when I'm asked to answer a question, I try to figure out what the words in the question mean. And what I've been asked to do today, respond to the question, something like, what is the promise of classical education? So I need to know what a promise is, what education is, and what makes classical education classical. So I'll attempt to do that. And then we'll also think about what the old question, what hath Athens to do with Jerusalem, which is to say, what does this form of education that we call classical have anything to do with our Abrahamic faith? Many people associate classical education closely with what has been called for about the past 100 years, but as far as I can tell, not much longer than that, the Socratic method, which is this idea that we read texts in common and discuss them in seminar, which is a great thing to do. But the more I teach Socrates, the more I come to feel that he wasn't really a philosopher. He was rather a philologist, because what he's interested in doing is figuring out what words mean. And that's how he annoys people. That's how he performs his gadfly commission from the oracle at Delphi. What is justice? I don't like that. Are you sure that's what that means? And that's the way he shows his love for wisdom is primarily, or at least in the first instance, by showing his love for words. So I feel like I'm on good ground here in starting there. And that's also one of the things we get from our other great common doctor in the Abrahamic faiths, Aristotle, is this idea that before we can know what we're doing and have a discourse, we have to define our terms. We have to come to terms with one another. I lack the discipline to be a very good scholastic philosopher or theologian, but one of the things I appreciate about the old neo-scholastic manuals is they always start with something called notiones previae, or the things we've got to come to agreement on before we can figure out what the heck we're talking about. So the first word we have is promise. And I would look at that and I would say, well, that's a Latin word, and that means that which is sent forth, promissum, something that's sent out into the world. When I thought a little bit more fundamentally about it, I thought, a promise is something that someone gives to someone else. And it's usually couched as, I promise I'll do this for you. And the other person expects to get something out of that person, right? So we could look at that for teachers who teach in classical education, for students who engage in classical education, or for their parents who allow them or compel them to engage in classical education. What are they going to get out of it, right? But then I thought, I don't think it's one-sided. I think we're talking about some kind of covenant. So what is the covenant of classical education? And I think that it's a really apt time for us to consider this, because a covenant is a voluntary agreement undertaken by two parties that implies or is explicitly bound by mutual obligation. So there's something that I'm giving in return for something that you're giving. And one of the key things, I teach history of education every spring, and I'm currently in it now. We haven't gotten there yet, but I think the most decisive change in the history of education is when it went about 120 years ago from being a voluntary association to being a compulsory duty. We're seeing a bit of a challenge of that right now as We have growth in charter schools, public-private partnerships, especially in places like Texas and the Southwest. So it's interesting. As a historian, I say it's interesting. I'm not a philosopher, so I can't say what we ought to do. I can merely say what has been done and report on what I'm viewing. And what I think I'm viewing is people are looking for a more covenantal form of education for their children, which is to say, we have a view in mind and we're going to go enter into partnership with a regime of education in order to produce a definite result. And in many cases, it's quite different from something like professional training or job skills, although people generally do want those things too. So people aren't sure what they want, but people are sure that they don't all want the same thing. And I think the next period in the history of education is going to be quite interesting to observe and perhaps even to participate in. But people are looking for a different covenant, a different sort of covenant, a different sort of promise than has been in the past. So that brings us to education. So I will attempt to define the genus first, following our good Aristotelian discipline, and go with education and then figure out what is meant by classical. As Dean Harold said, I'm currently drafting a history of education because I've found out that there aren't too many on the market, and most of those that are on the market will plainly state in the first chapter or so, education, as we define it, did not exist before the last quarter of the 19th century. And so we'll get one chapter for all of the history of education up to 1875 and 7 chapters on the history of education since 1875. This is no exaggeration. The only sizable history of education I've been able to find that doesn't follow this pattern was written in 1923. So there's work to be done, and I'm working to do that work. So that demonstrated to me when I made this discovery about 4 years ago, people don't mean the same thing when they say education. So what do we mean when we say education? And why are we so confused about what this thing is? How can it be the case that education has only existed for 150 years, if that is indeed the case? So following a popular trend, I propose here to give you a very brief history of education in 6 words, but I'm going to cheat a little bit. 3 of the words are Greek, 1 of the words is Latin, 2 of the words are German, and none of them are the Latin word educatio. So that was another interesting discovery of mine as I did my historical work, is that the Latin word for education is not educatio, as many people assume. I'll tell you what it is in just a bit, but the word education was not much used until the 18th century in any language. We go back to the origins of Greek education, which I think is appropriate to do. The first form that emerges as something like education is a word called kalokagathia, which is a great compressed word. It's a contraction for kalos kai agathos. So that's very stupidly translated as good and good. So just as Greek has 3 or 4 words for love, it has very many words for goodness. They're not all the same kind. So the first one is kalos, which means something like fineness or nobility or grace or gracefulness or something like that. The other one is agathos, which means upright morally. And in archaic Greece, in pre-classical Greece, even at the beginning of the classical period, that was the ideal for a young man to be, was kalos kai agathos, kalokagathos, and the abstract idea, kalokagathia. Our 2 great exponents of this idea are Professor Marou and Cardinal Newman. Because Professor Marou was French, he translated kalokagathia as chivalry, and because Cardinal Newman was English, he translated it as being a gentleman. I think that there are many people who desire that educational outcome when they send, especially their young men, to certain kinds of schools. But I think in the Democratic Republic of the United States of America, that's not the primary reason we educate our young men, and of course our young women as well. It's desired, but it's probably not primary. Socrates was the first person, at least insofar as we have recorded, in Greece to challenge this idea that kalokagathia was a sufficient basis for education. He said, it doesn't matter if you look good and you say nice things, you have to know why you say nice things. And then if you really want to be good and look good, you have to know what goodness is. So there has to be an intellectual component, not just a performative component. Excellence is important, but excellence in performance has to be rooted in some theory of the thing. One of the most radical experiments in educational reform was undertaken in Sparta sometime before the classical era. And their word for education, or the nearest we could get to education in classical Sparta, is something called agoge. Agoge comes from our Greek word agein, which means to drive. And we could translate agoge as cattle driving, which I think is appropriate. It tells us how Spartans thought about their children, what they thought they were doing. They were herding cattle. They were breeding them for a certain kind of excellence in a very particular kind of way. This kind of agoge, or cattle driving, and breeding has been mostly rejected as an appropriate educational goal, but I would argue only fairly recently, and unfortunately tried less than 100 years ago in totalitarian regimes, and perhaps will be tried again. So all that stuff 100 years ago that was inspired experiments in eugenics and breeding programs and militarization of society. We have to remember, as I like to say, if your historical span ranges widely enough, you start to see patterns and you realize it's not progress, it's more cyclical than anything else. So we don't, we may yet be headed back out of Sparta and back to, out of Athens and back to Sparta. But I hope I could say today that agoge is not terribly desired by any of us. That brings us to our third word, and this is what most people think education is when they say classical education, but I disagree for reasons will come clear, and that's the word paideia. And I'm going to cheat a little bit. So with paideia, I'm going to introduce two closely related, but not coterminous words, paidosis and paidelma, because all of those mean education in some sense, and they all don't mean education in another sense. So paideia has the same root, ped, like encyclopedia and pediatrician. It means child. So in its most abstract sense, paideia is child rearing. We already see in the Athenian model, which is where that word is used, it's a more humane, it's a very different idea of what we're doing with our offspring. In Sparta, we're engaged in cattle driving. And in Athens, we're engaged in child rearing. That's the abstract notion. Paidosis would be the particular process or regime by which we produce a definite paidelma. So I tell my students, you can use this tripartite division. You have the abstract idea, ea, you have the process, sis, and you have the product, ma. And that works very well with poeia, poesis, and poema. So poeia is poetry, poesis is poem making, and a poem is the product of a process of poesis. So we can all know that, right? If I say education's a good thing, I'm talking about paideia. But if I say he has a classical education, I'm saying he underwent a paidosis of a definite regime. And if I say he's very educated, I'm talking about paidelma. He possesses a product with him that we imagine he carries and uses for the rest of his life. So all of those together. I say paideia sounds like a great idea. But the problem is, as we learned from Plato and Aristotle, from Plato and Aristotle, their vision of reality, of politics, of the state and society, did not extend much beyond the confines of a very small city-state in ancient Greece. And the kinds of, we could say, state control and interference that they recommended in books like The Republic and the politics may be appropriate. I would argue that they weren't, but they may be appropriate at the level of the city, but I don't think are appropriate at the level of a large federal republic. The anecdote I always give to illustrate my concern about something like national paideia is that my first job out of graduate school was in South America, and I had to buy my house sight unseen from South America and move there 2 months later. The first piece of mail I got was a fine from the city I lived in because my grass was too tall, because I didn't think to hire someone to mow my grass. And I talked through this, and I had this insight, because I was putting together this class, and I thought, That's appropriate. My city, my local community ought to be able to regulate how tall my grass is. But I would be concerned about what state apparatus was involved and what level of observation if that bill had come from Washington, D.C. So it's not an absolute question of who gets to be involved. I think it's a question of subsidiarity. And I think that's one of the great things, one of the lessons that we ought to take from the 20th century is paideia is great. Paideia is necessary. We ought to engage in child rearing. It doesn't have the best track record when that much of our child rearing responsibility is put into the hands of such a small group of people who are not locally interested in what our concerns are. Who solved that problem? I would say the Romans. So the Roman word for education is institutio. And that's clear. I have a very strong philological case for this, and I'll show you the receipts. But institutio is the word for education. What the heck is that? You guys take care of your local culture. You guys take care of your religion. You guys take care of all the folk and tribal and national concerns. We're going to teach your kids how to speak publicly, how to serve their communities, how to serve the civilization that we've built. And we're going to work to find what is that optimal level of abstraction that applies to everyone. And I argue that that is really what classical education is. Yes, the tradition of Roman institutio flowed out of Greek paideia, but they were able to develop a system of education, a regime of education that survived for thousands of years and was capable of being applied not only in Europe, but in Mexico, in Russia, in parts of Africa, until very recently, precisely because it was so limited in scope. And I think that that is something that we ought to think about, this idea of what is a civilizational form of education, rather than what is a national form of education, or a state form of education, or a local form of education. And is it possible to respect and incorporate the local varieties within a larger structure? And that larger structure would necessarily have to be limited and abstract in nature. So that's the Roman thing. My last two words are German, and they are Bildung and Erziehung, and Provost Vorwerk is not here to correct me. But there was a big fight in Germany in the 19th century about which of these words would be the basis for the emerging German education system. Bildung, translated more or less literally, would mean something like formation. How does a child come to be an adult? And that's where we get the Bildungsroman, which is the novel of education or the novel of formation. The other one, Erziehung, is something like instruction. And this is where we get the very echt wissenschaftlich, or the very, very scientific, technically oriented aspect of Germany. I would say in present day, the Erziehung model has more or less won out. But that's because Bildung was tried, national Bildung was tried with disastrous results in the 1920s and 30s. One thing that a lot of Americans don't realize is that our public education system is directly inspired by the Prussian public education system. You had a bunch of Americans going over in the late 19th century to Germany to get a newfangled degree called the PhD, which didn't exist in England and didn't exist in the United States. And they founded the first research university. So it's interesting to think about that and compare that. And I would say that's really at the basis of our public education system, both at the K-12 level and in higher education. I try to explain the American system of education to my European friends, and there's no frame of reference for them, because I say there isn't an American system of education. There are 50, and it's pretty schizophrenic, because I think we have a private education system, which is primarily institutio, and we have a public education system, which is primarily Erziehung. And when I configured it that way, things started making a lot more sense to me. Okay, so I'm going to say what I'm talking about in the promise of classical education. I'm talking about institutio, and then I'm going to try to explain what I mean by classical. By classical,
Couple minutes left.
yeah, by classical I mean something along the lines of it has a fixed canon of texts that invite piety, preservation, commentary, debate, and reception over a very long period of time. It has this civilizational rather than national or tribal character, and its aims are cultural rather than political. Precisely because cultural rather than political, it's able to accommodate different nations and different tribes. And it's able to survive rapid political changes and revolutions in political regimes. What is it trying to produce? I say the faith of classical education is something like the philosophy of nature. The way I cheaply define nature is what's going to happen without you doing anything. That's nature. And from this form of institutio, we've got the natural law tradition, the idea of natural virtue, and as we said in the previous panel, something like Stoicism. So my time is short, and I hope to pick up a lot of these questions that I've opened up at the end of our session. But what I would argue is that this regime of education is still vital and can be recovered. It has had a very good run in the past. And we ask, what does it have to do with our Abrahamic phase? What I'll say to that is something like a renewal of the things that everyone used to know, what used to be called something like natural religion, which is to say there are certain things that we can know by reason about the universe, about nature, that are affirmed or assented to rather than believed. For the ancient pagans, that meant that God is good, God is true, God is beautiful, and even that God is one, but they didn't know that God was their father and wanted to have a relationship with him. But those other things are pretty good. That's pretty good for natural reason. And I'll conclude with a quote from one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis. He writes a sequel, fanfic for Paradise Lost or Pilgrim's Progress. He says, Pilgrim's Regress, he has chapter 6 entitled Ignorantia, and he remarks that till recently the northern people had been made to learn the languages of Paglos. And that meant that at least they started no further from the light than the old pagans themselves. I think that's worth working towards. And for me, that is the promise of education. And that's a sufficient thing that can get, I hope, a good number of us back together and aimed at these things that we can all affirm and assent to together to work towards a common good. Thank you.
Erik began his comments by telling a joke that given what he does, classicist, historian, historian of pedagogy, nobody really knows what he is and when it comes to his discipline. I'm a philosopher, so I have it worse. Everyone knows what my discipline is, and I have no idea what I am. I'm grateful to the University of Dallas to be here. It's a school I've long supported and encouraged many students to apply to, so I'm grateful to have received the invitation. I've been here in an informal basis many times, but it's the first time I've been involved in something academic here and delighted to be so. I was pleased to get the invitation, but however pleased I was to come to UD, I was more pleased to be able to chip in my own small voice in honor of Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, who is giving the endowed lecture, who's one of the best and wisest friends I know. And years from now, they'll say, oh yeah, Ricoeur and Gadamer gave that lecture, but so did Gottlieb. In the marketplace of ideas, and indeed in the marketplace of actual curricula, it's not so clear what classical education is. So Erik's worked us through a sense of the marketplace of ideas. We could mean institutio, we could mean idea, we could mean something else. And when it comes to the actual marketplace of curricula, there's a whole lot of publishing bodies and a whole lot of schools which promise to provide something of a classical education, and you can purchase it in this fashion or in that fashion, with this tuition or in that tuition. I was asked just this week on Monday from a student who was a graduate of a classical school what I thought of classical education. I said, well, it depends what you mean. I'm against most of it. Because it depends what you mean. And I'm against, it turns out, a whole lot of what in the marketplace of curricula is called classical education and what you can purchase. Because I think they make significant mistakes about what human knowledge is and the human being is. That's for another conversation. In the conversation today, I come not to blame it, but to praise it. Whatever else classical education is in the marketplace of ideas and in the marketplace of curricula, most of the alternatives claim in some fashion to represent a perennial tradition, whether it's a fixed canon or privileging a particular language or a long arc of tradition or a certain kind of conversation. There's something perennial that we inherit and that we place, the stream into which we place ourselves as part of the conversation. Now, that seems correct to me as a sort of overarching sense of what is in common in the various competitors for what classical education is. It works well enough for me. But as Mark mentioned in the last panel, I can't remember which rabbi it was, you have to read the times. In the Catholic tradition, we tend to say you need to read the signs of the times. And so while classical education may have something perennial about it, or it may aspire to something perennial about it, students and teachers do not exist in the perennial or in the abstract. They exist in their time. And so to reflect on classical education, I think, requires us to ask, what does classical education do and require? What are its threats, challenges, and promises for our students and our teachers and our institutions just now as they attempt to inhabit and convey classical education? When I think about this sort of classical education movement, very broadly construed, I have no fixed definition of that. It seems to me that it's often, in a sense, responsive, or in a neutral sense, reactionary. So if you think about after the GI Bill, World War II, we have this massive explosion of higher education in the United States. It doesn't seem to me to be accidental that as that explosion becomes more and more rooted in suspicion against the West, the hermeneutics of suspicion of people like Marx and Freud, Nietzsche, that you also see in various ways and in various accommodations, various classical education movements responding. You can think of something as simple as like the sort of Mortimer Adler, Aristotle for everyone, right? Or the early days of so-called Christian classical education, which meant a variety of things, whether one was Presbyterian or Catholic or what have you. A sense that there was too much suspicion, that the 60s were too riven by a hatred of our place, our time, our way of life. What the late, great Roger Scruton called oikophobia, right? A hatred of our own home, our own place. And so there was a sense that we need to rebuild our home, we need to rebuild our place, we need to have a kind of piety for what is ours. And there's a recovery attempt to not be suspicious or not overly suspicious and to recover something. I can't tell you how many young students I work with who will at some point convey something like, why were we robbed of our heritage? Why were we robbed of our liturgy? And there's a sense of they want something back. They're not sure what it is. They may have never experienced it, but it seems a lot better than 2026 and its flatness and disenchantment. Well, that you can see as well why after a certain kind of postmodernism, classical education can seem so earnest and direct and hopeful. If you've read recently Closing to the American Mind by Alan Bloom, one of the things that stands out is just the easygoing relativism of his students. That's what he notes. Nothing much matters, there's not much any truth, but it's okay. We're not really that dangerous because we're really easygoing relativists. We're not going to do anything to you. I think here is the theorist who's just the epitome of this is Richard Rorty in his account of irony. We don't believe anything except it's what we believe around here. We hold it very loosely and with a great deal of irony. We have no non-circular reasons why genocide is wrong, but don't worry, we're all against genocide around here. There's a kind of insouciance to it. You think the playfulness of Jacques Derrida and the endless deferral. There's an insouciance against meaning. You can see why a certain kind of earnest teacher or a certain kind of earnest students wants something perennial, wants something fixed, wants something serious, wants something to revere, to admire, to venerate, wants something that they feel beholden to. Now, that may describe in some fashion the response, maybe even the needed and necessary response of the classical education movement in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But I'd suggest that 2026 is far different in many ways, or at least maybe I just changed in my understanding of what was going on. Maybe everything is exactly the same and I'm interpreting it differently. But it seems to me there's something different. A whole lot of teachers in around 2015 said, I used to worry that my students were relativists. Now I kind of wish they were relativists. Because in 2015, everyone was a dogmatist. All the students were dogmatists. And they were full of righteous zeal for their dogma. They believed in social justice, they knew what it was, and they were here to bring it about. They weren't relativists. Now, they probably were in their deep theory. It probably was more will to power than a genuine understanding of justice. But there was no flirtation with relativism. You were wrong, and they were right. One of the marks that I sort of noticed of that is I remember when Trump was elected the first time. I'm an inveterate listener of NPR. I used to drive a Subaru, and a friend of mine said, "Is that the only station a Subaru gets?" And I laughed, and I bought a Volvo, and I still listen to NPR. Volvo counts too. In 2016, you'd notice at the New Yorker, NPR, and the New York Times a grave concern for truth that was not there in 2014 and was not there in 1995. In 1995, Jacques Derrida and Richard Rorty were basically the editorial pages of the Times and the spirit of the New Yorker. Not in 2016 and 2017, where truth emerged as a massive category that our liberal establishment journalists and thought leaders were concerned with, because they were reacting to what they took to be a kind of nihilism on the right, and now they were going to represent truth. The worry here was not relativism. The worry was dogma against dogma, force against force. Well, flash forward to 2026, it seems to me that things have changed yet again, or at least I've interpreted them differently. Maybe you have an account of everything is the same, but at least RJ changed his views of what's going on. In 2026, what I see is a whole lot of rampant nihilism again. Not so much dogmatism, it's not 2015. What I see is full-throated, unadorned, honest will to power on both the left and the right. Now, we can praise classical education as long as we wish, but Carl Schmitt and his readers were classically educated. Bronze Age pervert was classically educated. A whole lot of what I take to be the alt-right Catholic fundamentalist world is not only Catholic educated, but severely devoted to classical education. And they're nihilists. They're nihilists because they believe, out of a sort of peak of rage, that the point is a kind of power. I was recently called by a student, I took this with a mark of great pride actually, a beautiful loser. Now, the reason I took that out of pride is I was always told that the ancient ideal just meant beautiful man. And I was like, well, I finally attained it. I'm beautiful. But I'm a beautiful loser. Why? Because the point of politics and the point of education was for your side to utterly destroy your enemies who are a civilizational threat to all that is good. And you're a loser if you're someone like me who believes that politics the point of politics is not to win at the cost of your soul. So I'm the sort of person apparently who has fine ideas about justice and fine ideas about Burkean civility and civil society and little platoons. But that always makes you a loser, and your enemies will destroy you. And so better to be someone like Bronze Age pervert or the integralists or those who deny civility in order to win. And here's my worry. A whole lot of the proponents of integralism, which I take to be decisively rejected by the church, believe in classical education. A whole lot of the incipient, growing, quite dangerous anti-Semitism among Catholic fundamentalists is informed by a certain kind of commitment to the perennial truth laid down once and for all in the deposit of faith that we have, that we own, and we will now articulate to you. That's a form of classical education, too. I'm not suggesting it's a true form of classical education. I'm suggesting in the marketplace of ideas and the marketplace of curricula, that is a live option that is alive. I teach a lot of young men in college, and a lot of them really believe in classical education. And a whole lot of them are not so sure about the question of the Jews because the Jews don't fit into the story of classical education. Well, sign me out of classical education if that's what it means. I'm not suggesting that is what it means, but sign me out of the cultural milieu if that's the implication. Now, here's my worry. My worry is that when classical education is done poorly, or when it's done out of a kind of fundamentalist craving need for fixity, certainty, taxonomy, that kind of Cartesian anxiety where what we're really worried about is that we might not know, that what people look for is an answer. And they look for a fixed answer. And they look for an answer which is true always and everywhere and is equally the same in all places and all times, whatever the question happens to be. I'm a Thomist of a sort, and you know that old joke that non-Thomists will say about Thomas, right? Like, well, of course, Thomas, not only did he give all the answers, he gave all the questions. you come up with a question, it's like, no, Thomas didn't ask that question. That's not worth asking. You're like, well, it's mine. And they look at you like, I know. I've just told you that's not really worth asking. Certainty and fixity and the comfort of an answer is, to my mind, not the point of classical education, and is indeed, at our moment, very dangerous by those who are perhaps not real adherents to classical education, but are adjacent and believe that they are proponents, adherents, and practitioners of classical. It seems to me that rather than the answer, what's first in classical education is the question. I disagree. I do not believe Socrates was a philologist. I believe he's a philosopher. He uses philology in order to get people to aporia. And the grand test in the early dialogues are whether you're going to be Meno or Theaetetus in response to aporia. You may receive a sort of recognition that you don't know the answer, and you can be angry with Socrates because you know the answer, do you not? You represent the best that has been thought and said. You already know. Or you can be the virtuous young character who hears Socrates and thinks, you really did sting me there, gadfly, and I have no idea. I must admit my ignorance, and I now must enter into the community of inquiry with humility and discretion and honesty and an honest, thorough admission that I do not know. Now, in addition to aporia or the question, it seems to me that the goal of classical education is not to have mastered a fixed canon. There may very well be a fixed canon or a fixed-ish canon for classical education, but there's lots of people who well know the fixed canon of so-called classical education who are very droll at cocktail parties. You know the sort? I mean, these are the sort of cocktail parties I go to. They're not very fun. Well, as Dante said, chuckle, chuckle. You know, they have theories about the hammered dulcimer. Okay, I guess you are a Wikipedia-style educated person. You know things. There's other people who have mastered the canon who have all the answers and no questions. They're useless and generally dangerous. Then there are those who forbid the questions because they already know the answers, and questions are very disabling. That's what I think of as the fundamentalist mind. Aporia has as its entry point into education and the community of inquiry, it seems to me that knowledge is too broad and too vacuous. I think what we're looking for is sound judgment. The point of classical education, or a central point of classical education around which the other very valid points can be built, and I think around which they have their meaning, is an exercise of sound judgment. Bronze Age pervert knows a lot about Sparta and does not have sound judgment. The young integralists may know a lot about the tradition and lack sound judgment. The young Catholic fundamentalists I know may know, the way my daughter puts it is, they have the entire library of Baronius Press, but don't pray. They lack sound judgment. I don't know if you get the Baronius Press references. Like one guy laughed at that. He's like, yeah. It's true. I have their Catechism of Trent version. It's not against the press itself. Yes, I've read Trent too. Sound judgment is an interesting thing because it's not merely about assent to truth. It also entails consent of the will. Judgment is a thing in which the person cannot be removed. It is I, RJ, who judges this to be the truth. And it is I, RJ, who comes with my own education, my own foibles, my own biases, my ignorances, to this judgment. And it's not merely that I assent that it's true, I'm committed in some fashion to its truth. So I'm responsible for my commitment to the truth, to my claim that it's the truth, because my will is caught up in it as well. I'm responsible for my judgments. I can be called out on the carpet for my judgments. I can be blamed for my judgments. I can be praised for my judgments. I can be thought of as someone who's not particularly intelligent or astute. You can imagine it if you try. But I'm sound. You know this sort? I think this was our proverbial plumber that Erik was defending earlier in the panel. He's sound. Is he erudite? Maybe not. Is he sound? Yes, he is. Is he against paganism? Yes, he is. Who would you prefer to have? Well, with Buckley, I'd prefer him and the next 400 picked names in the phone book than the Harvard faculty, the faculty of Harvard, whatever their erudition. But if judgment is not merely a matter of sort of intellectual tricks to get to a judgment of the truth or falsity of things, but includes me as a person making that judgment, including the consent of my will, then it seems to me that a core goal and motivation of classical education is to introduce students to themselves. At the end of the last panel, Mark briefly made reference to Dietrich von Hildebrand. I happen to think that there is no classical education that does not in the end give a central role, whether at the beginning or the end, to phenomenology very broadly understood. All I mean by phenomenology there is not necessarily in the school and tradition of Husserl. I just mean an introduction to one's own acts of intellect and acts of will, which brought you to the point where you are willing to affirm and commit to this judgment and the actions and practices which this judgment would entail or suggest. And you are aware not only of, in a sense, the third personal description of, here are the things that I claim. Here's what the Catechism says. Here's what Thomas says. Those things can very well be true. But here is why I affirm these things. Here are the reasons that I give for these things. Here are the arguments that I find compelling for these things. Here is my act of will, such that in every judgment and in every act of education, we are introducing students to themselves. We are reminding ourselves of our own status as persons, created in the image of God, who are ultimately and fundamentally free and responsible for what we believe and what we do.
So Josh Parens. So as Mark Goodwin can attest, I actually contemplated originally doing a little bit of a drive-by shooting of integralism, I'm afraid, but I decided not to go that route. But anyway, just very interested to know a Thomist who would do that. But anyway, so my talk is called "The Difference in the Place of Wisdom in Judaism and Christianity." So this is actually based on one formulation of the question. You'll just notice that all of us are kind of coming at this at a slightly different angle. But one of the things we were told, the promise of classical education. Panelists will discuss how classical education informs students in the virtues of wisdom, justice, and faith. And I've decided to just focus on wisdom. So initially I debated with myself about whether to make this a talk solely about the history of classical education at the University of Dallas and its eventual collaboration with Tikva in New York and New Jersey, or solely about wisdom and virtue as considered by my great teacher, the towering genius of medieval Judaism, Moses Maimonides. I decided ultimately that I needed both. The history to explain the admirable ambition of our Tikva collaborators, Rabbi Mitch Rocklin, Tikva CEO Eric Cohen, and Rabbi Mark Gottlieb, and the foray into Maimonides to explore some of the particular challenges of the UD-Tikva collaboration. Because both the understandings of and the place of wisdom in Judaism and Catholic Christianity are different, the task of establishing classical education in each is inevitably different. Interest in this collaboration first began with contacts between Rabbi Rocklin and two former students and eventual employees of mine when I was Braniff Graduate Dean, Matthew Post and John Peterson. After I wrestled curriculum proposals for classical education through UD's Faculty Senate, Matt Post would take the lead in recruiting students and building out our classical ed program. Post and Peterson both came into contact with Rabbi Rocklin through Princeton's James Madison program. Now, since classical education started at UD in 2016, and our classical education program for Jewish teachers, collaboration with Tikva, was only started as I left my post in 2022, there was a lot that had to get done starting back in, 2019, in talks with then Constantine Dean, J.J. Sanford, who was an old friend of Rabbi Gottlieb's, and with Eric Cohen and me. That UD would be the first institution of higher ed to collaborate with Tikva on a master's program in teacher education was far from a foregone conclusion. However, as Dean Sanford rose to provost and eventually president of UD, we had the enthusiastic support of UD's leadership. Now, leaving aside names and dates, why do I refer to the admirable ambition of our Tikva collaborators? As I mentioned earlier, the understandings of and place of wisdom are different in Christianity and Judaism. These differences are most evident from the different conception of the Queen of the Sciences in each tradition, namely in Christianity, theology, and in Judaism, Talmud, or what the medievals called jurisprudence. Of course, wisdom in Christianity is the aim of theology. In Judaism, although the law is our wisdom and understanding before the nations, Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 6 through 8, here an important ambiguity in the meaning of wisdom must be observed. Wisdom, chokhmah in Hebrew, is tied in the Jewish tradition to the heart, lev. However, much as in the pre-philosophic Greek tradition, the heart is an ambiguous locus of many aspects of our humanity, intellectual, moral, and emotional. It is due to this ambiguity that heart or lev is often translated as mind. Wisdom, in the relevant Deuteronomy passage, likely refers to the guidance to moral virtue that the law provides. What might seem like a small difference between the Christian tradition's emphasis on wisdom as intellectual and the Jewish tradition's emphasis on wisdom as moral has many repercussions. It is not by chance that there are precious few Jewish colleges and universities in the world. In contrast, of course, the very idea of the university emerged in the medieval Catholic university. This then should help us appreciate just how ambitious were our collaborators at Tikva. Yet their ambition did not come out of nowhere. Tikva is affiliated with a trend in Judaism called modern orthodoxy. Among other things, modern orthodoxy attempts to blend the more traditional study of the Talmud, the bottomless reservoir of rabbinic law and legend, with modern European learning. Arguably, the greatest light of modern orthodoxy in America, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, was the great uncle of one of Tikva's current greatest lights, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. Tikva's interest in classical education indicates that as time has gone on, the interest in the Western tradition, including Greek philosophy, has become even more expansive than it was under the influence of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik. Now let us turn back from some of these historical details to more substantive matters. Maimonides explores, however subtly, this ambiguity about wisdom, whether it has a primarily moral or intellectual sense in the Hebrew Bible, in the last chapter of his magnum opus, The Guide of the Perplexed, Part 3, Chapter 54. He refers to this when saying things like, quote, "The science of the Torah is one species, and wisdom is a different species, being the verification of the opinions of the Torah through correct speculation. The law, the Torah, and the Talmud concerns themselves first and foremost with action. In two excruciatingly complex chapters on opinions and actions, in Guide, Part 3, chapters 27 through 28, which we cannot explore in any detail now, Maimonides asks the question we touch on here. Just how concerned with speculation or theoretical knowledge is the law. To pursue further the distinct character of wisdom in Judaism, according to Maimonides, we turn now from his very challenging guide to his more accessible Mishneh Torah, his codification or summation of the Talmud. For anyone in our audience who is unaware, the Talmud is in fact two different works, the Jerusalem and Babylonian versions, the latter being the more authoritative. Maimonides, having written his commentary on the Mishnah based on study of both versions of the Talmud, eventually produced his great reduction of the Talmud, the Mishneh Torah. His ambition in codifying the Talmud or oral law was never particularly well hidden. Mishneh Torah is the Hebrew name for what is referred to more generally as Deuteronomy, the fifth book of the Torah or Pentateuch. In other words, he was presenting his Mishneh Torah as if it were the fifth book that would summarize all of the Talmud. The way he puts it in the introduction to the Mishneh Torah is that a Jew may study the Hebrew Bible and Maimonides' Mishneh Torah and acquire all that is worth acquiring from the Talmud. This revolutionary claim did not prevent the continued study of the Talmud. Some interpret that as an indication that Maimonides failed. I disagree for reasons that I hope will become evident. Now, in the first volume of the Mishneh Torah, the Book of Knowledge, in a part titled Laws Concerning Talmud Torah, or Laws Concerning the Study of the Torah, Maimonides prescribes the following regimen to the Jew who wishes to study the Torah properly. Quote, the time allotted to study should be divided into three parts. A third should be devoted to the written law, that is the Torah, or the Pentateuch mainly, or the whole Hebrew Bible. A third to the oral law, in other words, the Talmud. And the last third should be spent in reflection, deducing conclusions from premises, developing implications of statements, comparing dicta, studying the hermeneutical principles by which the Torah is interpreted, till one knows the essence of these principles and how to deduce what is permitted and was forbidden from what one has learned traditionally. This is termed Talmud. All of that. Now, all this seems innocuous enough until we hear his more detailed explication by way of an example of what he means by those three parts: the Torah, the Talmud, and then the techniques of studying Talmud, right? Those were basically the three parts previously mentioned, with an occasional odd word like just reflection, which may mean just reflection on the techniques of studying the Talmud or not. It's not overwhelmingly obvious. Now that all seems pretty innocuous, but the example really then proves to be explosive in the way that Maimonides tends to characteristically be. For example, if one is an artisan who works at his trade 3 hours daily and devotes 9 hours to the study of the Torah. Notice, by the way, that's the Jewish understanding of the way one should live. Right? 3 hours to make a living and 9 for study. He should spend 3 of these 9 hours in the study of the written law, 3 in the study of the oral law, and the remaining 3 in reflecting on how to deduce one rule from another. The words of the prophets are comprised in the written law, while their exposition falls within the category of the oral law. And here's where the bomb is dropped. The study styled Pardes, or included in Talmud. Pardes, a loan word taken from Persian, which means paradise, and of course is a reference to the Garden of Eden. This plan applies to the period, so the plan he just gave you, where he just basically recapitulated written law, oral law, techniques of studying the law. But then he drops in Pardes, and he says, this plan applies to the period when one begins learning Talmud, right? So there's this fundamental ambiguity that the word Talmud refers to the great text, but is also simply learning as such. But after one has become proficient and no longer needs to learn the written law or continually to be occupied with the oral law, he should, at fixed times, read the written law and traditional dicta so as not to forget any of the rules of the Torah, and should devote all his days exclusively to Talmud according to his breadth of mind and maturity of his knowledge. Of course, the question is what he meant by Talmud at the end. Two things actually stand out in this passage: the ambiguity surrounding Talmud and the sudden appearance for us of Pardes. We start with the latter. Earlier in the Mishnah Torah, Maimonides defines Pardes as the account of the beginning and the account of the chariot. Historically, these would have meant the mysteries of creation and of the divine theophanies of Exodus, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. However, in both the Mishnah Torah and the Guide, Maimonides identifies them with natural science and divine science, or physics and metaphysics. In other words, these are the studies that in the Greek and Arabic philosophic traditions with which Maimonides was deeply conversant were referred to as wisdom. Let us turn now to the ambiguity surrounding Talmud. Above all, it must be remembered that the term Talmud literally means study or learning. Indeed, this discussion is contained in the part of the Mishnah Torah called Hilchot Talmud Torah, laws concerning the study of the Torah. Now, by the end of the preceding long quotation, Maimonides has shifted attention from devoting 2/3 or more of one's time as a learned Jew to studying the Talmud, either its text or the procedures of jurisprudence applicable to it, to studying Pardes. How has he done this? Primarily through his shifting use of that one ambiguous word, Talmud. In the first paragraph, Talmud is used to refer to the original 3 areas of study set forth: written law, oral law, and the methods of drawing inferences. In the first half of the second paragraph, Talmud appears to encompass or include Pardes. And in the second half of the second paragraph, the more learned one becomes, the less time one must necessarily devote to Torah and Talmud proper, and Talmud as study comes to be filled with Pardes. This ambitious program of ever-increasing attention to the highest studies of philosophy is hardly a plan intended for every learned Jew. Rather than intending to displace the Talmud proper, Maimonides produced his Mishnah Torah not only to produce greater clarity about what was the effective truth of the Talmud, that is, what the law requires, but also, and I suspect especially, to make it possible for the most ambitious of learned Jews to devote their lives to the pursuit of the highest forms of knowledge rather than to further mastering every nook and cranny of the sea that is the Talmud proper. Where does this leave us regarding wisdom at its place in Judaism? Even before Maimonides, Judaism had a secretive view of highest studies. Then it was because the highest studies were understood in mystical terms. Of course, mysticism is often and reasonably characterized as esoteric. Even for the interpreter who disagrees with my interpretation of Maimonides, I hope that it is evident that wisdom is a bit off-center or eccentric in Judaism. It is hardly the aim of every Jew, nor is it even the aim of our version of the ancient priesthood of Israel, the rabbinate. Rabbis need not study nearly as much philosophy as must the contemporary Catholic priests. Since wisdom is not the obvious aim of the law, this should not be surprising to us. Having said all that, Jewish classical education must necessarily navigate the challenging problem of how to relate the law to wisdom. I'm delighted that the world has changed enough that we are able once again to live in the vital tension between the primary aims of the law and wisdom.
Okay, so I've been a theology professor at UD for longer than I can remember, and I think I know what I am. Although within theology, there are all sorts of sub-disciplines, so I'm more of a biblical theologian than a Thomist, although I respect and love Thomas's teaching a lot. So I'm going to tackle our focal topic today from a theological and scriptural perspective. And the topic, as Josh just articulated it, is what is the promise of classical education? And how can it inform students in the virtues of wisdom, justice, and faith? And so I'm going to focus on two of those virtues, wisdom and faith. I'm going to begin with faith. In speaking of the virtue of faith, I immediately thought of Thomas Aquinas and Aquinas' teaching on the theological virtues, the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, as expressed by Paul in 1 Corinthians. Faith comes first in that triad of faith, hope, and love. It has precedence. What is it? For Thomas, it is an infused grace that moves one toward God. It affects the will, elevates the will, but it is also a grace that bestows a new and higher life on the mind. In fact, perfecting the intellect. It's something that elevates the intellect and that allows humans to attain truths about God. Faith thus enables people to attain truths about God, and for a long time in Western civilization, these truths about God have formed a kind of a foundational foundation for the truths of Western civilization. For Catholics, the truths of Western civilization, the truths about God, come through two sources, Scripture and tradition. Those are the two sources of divine revelation. And I'm going to focus on Scripture as a source of divine revelation. Take, for example, Genesis 1, Pardes, the first creation story. In Genesis 1, of course, we have God making the world, and God also making human beings in his image and likeness. So Genesis 1 gives us these foundational truths about human beings, who human beings are, and specifically, human beings made in the image and likeness of God. What does it mean to say that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God? A few years ago, Pope Benedict wrote a neat little commentary reflecting on this truth of human beings made in the image and likeness of God. And here's what he said. He said, in the human being, heaven and earth touch one another. In the human being, God enters into creation. The human being is directly related to God. Therefore, human life stands under God's special protection because each human being, however wretched or exalted he or she may be, however sick or suffering, however good for nothing or important, whether born or unborn, each one is God's image. This is the deepest reason for the inviolability of human dignity. and upon it is founded ultimately every civilization. So Benedict here elaborates on the meaning of what it means to be made in the image and likeness of God, and it leads directly to this notion of human dignity, human dignity. All humans have a special dignity that comes from being made in God's image. There is a sacred worth to human life as it is under God's care. Each human being, in one way or another, reflects the image and likeness of God. And Benedict also recognizes that this teaching on human dignity is foundational for Western civilization. And he also wrote a lot about his concerns for how this value of human dignity has become eroded and is in decline in the West. Let me turn now to the virtue of wisdom. And again, Thomas Aquinas is helpful. He teaches that wisdom is one of the intellectual virtues that can guide people to a good and virtuous life. It enables the practical skill of judging things rightly in the course of life. So practicing sound judgment here, as we heard earlier. As a virtue, it is the habit of choosing well, making good choices. But how can this habit be cultivated and developed? Again, I'd like to turn to Scripture as a way of responding. And in this case, I'd like to turn to the wisdom books. Catholics have wisdom books in the third part of their Old Testament, in between the historical books and the prophets. And Jews have it in that third and final part of the Tanakh, the Ketuvim. Some of you may be familiar with these wisdom books, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job. In the wisdom books, wisdom is a gift from God. And it is also a gift that enhances the practical skill of managing life's affairs. Some of the interesting and edifying features of the wisdom books are as follows. The wisdom books, especially Proverbs, reflect the ancient teaching activity of Israel's wisdom sages or teachers. And as such, they reflect the teaching activity in the schoolrooms of ancient Israel, schoolrooms in which young people were educated in the ways of wisdom, the ways of pursuing an ethical life, a good life, a life that could lead to happiness. Also, the wisdom teaching in Proverbs takes the form of a collection of maxims or proverbs that hand down the wisdom of prior generations and their lived experience of human life. Further, the proverbs or maxims often take the form of short, pithy, wise sayings, which were then studied in the classroom and very likely memorized in their ancient settings. In this way, then, practical wisdom was something that could be studied and learned in the classroom and handed down from one generation to the next. There are numerous examples of this practical wisdom in the book of Proverbs, giving advice on how to avoid vices and cultivating a wise manner of living. One of my favorites is in Proverbs 6. Proverbs 6 has a charming little proverb on the dangers of laziness and sloth, based upon the observation of ants. And in Texas, we know all about ants. They are annoying little creatures that seem to be everywhere in the summer. I guess they were in ancient Israel, too. Anyway, Proverbs 6 says, "Go to the ant, O sluggard, study her ways and learn wisdom. For though she has no chief, no commander or ruler, she procures her food in the summer, stores up her provisions in the harvest. How long, O sluggard, will you lie there? When will you rise from your sleep? A little slumber, a little folding of the arms to rest. Then poverty will come upon you like a robber and want like a brigand." Here is a wisdom that is empirical and practical. It observes the ways of nature and the lessons that nature has to teach. The proverb articulates lessons about diligence as well as knowing the times and the seasons, when to be diligent and when to cease from labor. Further, in Israel's ancient wisdom, in the wisdom books, wisdom is more than prudent human action. It has a faith dimension to it. As Proverb 9:10 puts it, Proverbs 9:10 says, "The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. The knowledge of the Holy One is understanding." The beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord. Here, wisdom has its beginning from the fear of God, and this fear of God is not so much the emotion of fear, but rather a habit or disposition of mind, a kind of reverence before the Creator, and a faith-based sense of how one stands within the order of creation. Wisdom, in other words, is not just a human capacity, but something that comes from God. And for the wisdom writers, God is the source of wisdom. In Israel's wisdom tradition, then, wisdom is a faith understanding of things that is also integrated into the human capacity for thinking and learning and a virtuous life. If we had more time, we could take this notion of biblical wisdom a little further and discover that wisdom is also an attribute of God. There are many layers to this notion of chokmah, or Sophia, in the scriptures. In Proverbs 8, for example, wisdom is portrayed as the personified agent of God who participated in God's making of the world. In Proverbs 3:18, the Lord by wisdom founded the earth. Anyway, my big point is that the study of Scripture could be useful in classical education and specifically in the task of informing students on the virtues of faith and wisdom, and I assume also justice. We don't have time for justice at this point. So a final thought, echoing Rabbi Mitch's thought, I am encouraged by today's discussions of the promise of classical education for a number of reasons, one of which is that it has brought together Jews and Catholics in a common mission of promoting Western values. And I want to echo Rabbi Mitch's comment about promoting and encouraging biblical literacy. For Catholics, there is that Old Testament canon that is very, very important. And I've always taught in my classes, you cannot understand Jesus apart from the Old Testament, apart from Tanakh and the Jewish scriptures. And I could go on for an hour on that, but I won't. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you to our panelists. We're going to open it up for questions. We have a little over 20 minutes. Bye-bye.
RJ, your remarks were pretty provocative. Sure you meant it. Is your critique of classical education more about how it's being packaged, how it's being marketed? Something that at its inception also had the seed of some of these more degenerative forms that you identified for us today? Is this more of a times, or have this as a more perennial turn?
If you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and repeat the question just for our broadcast. So the question is, Dr. Snell's critique, is that a critique of the times, or is it more perennial for classical education?
So I don't mean it to be a critique of classical education per se, nor do I intend it to be a critique of the times just per se. Of those two, you can imagine which I'm more critical of, which would be the times. My worry is the mood which has emerged against the times, where a misappropriation of classical education is doing disservice to the church, the world, and our friends. So here's a very thin analogy. I wouldn't suggest this is overlapping. So years ago, Mark taught me an essay by Chaim Soloveitchik called Rupture and Reconstruction. It's a very complicated essay, but one of the claims, as I understood it in this essay, is that after the Shoah, you have this crisis in Jewish practice because the lived tradition of the people is in some ways broken or disrupted. What had happened in grandma's kitchen really showed you how kosher worked. But grandma was unable to pass along the practices of her kitchen to her own daughters because of the disruption of death and placement. And this in part explains, maybe especially in North America, the rise of sort of book culture of law. Right, so if you think you're not supposed to separate on the Sabbath, right? All grandmothers had separated bones from fish from time immemorial. That's the example from the essay. But strictly,
Filter fish.
But strictly speaking, to take the bone from the fish violates the law, and the new books might tell you that. And as I remember the end of the essay, Soloveitchik says something like the following. Bereft and removed from the presence of God, you'll correct me, they have replaced it with the will of God, right? The law of God replaces the actual intimacy with God. The very thin analogy I want to make is, in very convoluted times where there's a lot of nihilism around, a whole lot of people are using classical education to replace not the presence of God, but the freedom of the children of God, not with will, but with certainty. We are promised very little certainty. That's my claim.
Eric, you want to respond to that?
Yes, I've
Or Mitch,
read.
you probably Mitch. I'd love to hear some conversation amongst the panelists on that point.
I read a good bit of these essays that are being written, and I would say I could point to any number of examples of people who used classical education in its proper form as a resistance against the totalitarianism of the 20th century. Perhaps most famously, Pope Benedict said, insofar as the education he received was classical, it was a refuge from the totalitarian invasion of the Third Reich, and he found his freedom, his intellectual freedom, there, and these sort of transcendent civilizational values were still available to him insofar as that was still available in the German education system that brought him up. I think what these people want is archaic education, not classical. So if we're going to map it onto any period of the past of the West, they want Homeric education. And philosophy, in my view, is a reaction against the Homeric.
They like the pre-Socratic an awful
They
lot.
like the pre-Socratic, they like the oracular, they like the mystical, they like arete in the sense of excellence rather than virtue. And they just need to read deeper into the tradition. That's my, they've stopped at the beginning and not progressed.
It's also always a danger, meaning it is a danger, and it's also the same danger can be applied to religion, meaning we can face a religious revival and say that the religious revival will lead people to the point where as soon as the declaration is made that I know what's right and I've done something sufficient, or I've done things that are sufficient, then the danger arises. True religion, taking real responsibility for myself as a human being and for the God who inspires me to be human, involves not being able to say I've ever done enough. I've never done enough. And so there's a humility that comes with that. So I think that it's always important to remember, and this is where I think the story of classical education is often told incorrectly, and therefore it's a problem, that it didn't begin as a reaction to the 60s or 70s, et cetera. It was around for a very long time. It was what education was. And many of my European friends will say they're very puzzled by the American narrative around classical education. So the revival of something good many people can revive something that's good and use it for nefarious purposes. And I think that what's going on in these times is two things. One is that you have very bad actors who are nefariously using it. And you also have people who are responding to the utter despair that characterizes education in general by wanting to resurrect notions that used to be common sense and just accept it as a given, but are now not accepted. So for example, you ought to know things. You ought to read books. Wow, that's very, it used to be understood. So it's I think it's complicated, and I also think that one of the ways to prevent the misuse and the nefarious purposes to which this can be used for is to ground it in what it was really meant to be grounded in context of the legacy that is our common civilization as Jews and Christians, which is to ground it in love. Love is really the basis for education. It's not simple reason on its own. This is where Hans Christian Andersen and Dostoevsky do such a good job of showing the framing. So to avoid having the answers, to avoid the problem of the Grand Inquisitor in Dostoevsky, which I think is what you're saying, we do have to emphasize that it's a humane education, and it's an education that's based on love as its highest purpose. And if it's done that way, I think it will hopefully be able to overcome its misuse. But
So I agree with all of that. So in classical education, there is something perennial about it, but I'm quite confident that people involved and interested in classical education are people of a time and place, and they have motivation. So why is TICFA trying to start? There's a time and place motivation. That doesn't make it nefarious. It means you are people who operate within a
This
time and a
the
place.
factors that you're concerned about, that's the convergence.
So I'm convinced that in a free state like Texas, where there's a lot of educational freedom, that within 100 miles of Dallas, there are 300 Christian classical schools, maybe more. A whole lot of them formed in 1970s, 80s, some of them very small, church basement sort of places. Some of them, I'm sure, quite large, very sophisticated, large endowments. And a whole lot of those, and I ascribe no blame, right? This is not nefarious. We're responding to what they took to be the crisis of relativism, skepticism, suspicion, cultural decline, cultural hatred of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? Because they're responding to a felt cultural need. And they were, in my mind, quite genuine to do so. I have no criticism of that. But you flash forward in 2026, right? There is perhaps other cultural issues going on in addition to suspicion and relativism and cultural decline. And there are those who would turn to classical education. Some of them clearly are vitalists. They're sort of pre-Socratic, Homerian vitalists. Others of them are sort of Thomists on steroids. Some of them love logic. So read Cream Finister's Integralist Handbook. It's a book on politics, which is just, it's just Euclidean geometry. Here are 3 premises about human nature, and here is the tax code and the Jewish ghettos. No kidding, that's how the book works. I mean, it's a pure exercise of Euclidean logic. It's like geometrical reason done perfectly. And it turns out most of the arguments, in a sense, are valid. They're just wildly unsound and have no political judgment whatsoever because they confuse metaphysics with politics, or what Aristotle in the Commentary on the Ethics would say is the distinguishing between the first order of reason and the third, theory and practical reason. That's not sound judgment. And my own sense, rightly or wrongly, is that we're now in a period of real nihilism, and that a whole lot of people, not limited to, but you see it a whole lot among young men and a whole lot among young Catholic men, outraged at the nihilism, are looking for certainty rather than freedom. And they are using or misusing quite valid normal tools of classical education. It's not a criticism of classical education, but it is a warning that not all good things are always well used.
Classical ed is subject to all of the problems liberal education has defined and understood. Liberal education in the United States means 1,001 things.
We're against it.
Same thing with classical. The only difference is that in the case of liberal education, that's what applies at the level of higher ed. Whereas classical ed, for the most part, refers to K through 12. And that has all those peculiar problems that I think RJ was talking about. They're overlapping, they're related, but it's funny, our confusion, I think, about liberal education is in a way more innocuous. Because I think everyone knows that higher ed is somewhat bankrupt. But I think there's more confusion when it comes to classical ed, and therefore more opportunity for people to grab a hold of it and do these nefarious things.
I also, no, I think that the reason for the appeal of classical education, in my experience, is actually a response to ignorance. It's not an appeal to certainty. It's an appeal to knowledge. It's a desire to provide an education, because without knowledge, where will we be? It's not, I don't think there's a way to cultivate sound judgment in people. Meaning,
There's no technique.
right? There's no technique. There's no playbook by which to do it. If we could say, well, people should just be simple religious people. Well, there's religious fanaticism, which leads us to exactly the same problem. The declaration that I have it, I have what I need, and now I can start doing all kinds of nasty things because I have it. So I often get the critique, oh, Carl Schmitt, had a classical education. So why are we doing classical education? This is something that keeps people away from knowledge as the basis for thought out of fear. Jews in particular, huge numbers of Jews are frightened from it because they see it as oh, well, look at these people who had it. As Professor Parens is saying, it's not a panacea. It's just a tool to help us to be human. So it will be used by devilish people who want to destroy humanity itself just the same. But I think we have to, I agree with your concern, and I think that that's one of the reasons why in this movement, we have to win the internal battle over the question of what classical education is and ought to be.
And I think it's why I'm such in favor of what you're doing here, because I trust that you're going to do this well. So you've probably met, if you're around a lot of students, you've probably met a graduate who's used some sort of classical curriculum. There's a lot of them out there. We homeschool our own kids, so we've read every curriculum under the sun. I've probably used them at one point under the sun where kids don't know what's going on. And you can find a certain kind of child whose parents' community was worried about ignorance, right? And you ask them a question, and the way I tend to describe it is their eyes go up and to the right because they're reciting answers. So you get this a lot in kind of the old catechism sort of model, like what is the purpose of life? And their eyes go up and to the right, and the purpose of life is, right? And they give a good answer. It's true. It's probably better than the kid who's not catechized. Well, it's certainly better than the kid who's not catechized. And maybe truer than the kid who got kind of like a, appropriate it for yourself as you go along in life's journey. It's about a journey, not a destination kind of catechism. But God really loves you and wants you to go to heaven, right? It's a truer answer. Have they appropriated it? Is it in Newman's language personal knowledge, or is it merely notional knowledge? And when the eyes go up and to the right and you hear them reciting to you, the enemy there is not ignorance, right? Because they're still ignorant.
I have a more practical question. In full disclosure, I started the classical school this year, so that informs some of this. Is how do you avoid the pitfalls that you're discussing? And secondly, is vouchers are about ready to come online in Texas next year, and so there's going to be just an explosion of classical schools. Who is the gatekeeper? Do we need a gatekeeper? How do you gatekeep the gatekeeper, which now has to be approved by the state of Texas? Do you have any practical advice for parents, educators that are out in the trenches doing this? And secondly, how do you educate the parents, which is one of the biggest challenges we have, is parents are coming and saying, I want a classical education, and trying to get them to articulate what it is that they want. It's really, you're having to tell them what are the ends of education, what are we doing? Any comments or thoughts on those?
Okay, so let's repeat the question. So the question is, how do we avoid the pitfalls that we've been discussing of classical education? And in Texas, with educational savings accounts and an explosion of this, what is their practical advice and educating the parents who are giving the classical education?
Yeah.
Gatekeeping, like what is classical? How that's happening, but it's not even a good thing. And how do we address it?
I can give a somewhat impractical answer to the first question and a practical answer to the second question. So the impractical answer is, as a historian, I'm convinced that for most of its history, classical education has meant 3 hours of Latin and 2 of math every day. I have not found any school who wants to implement that curriculum. in 2026, but I would point to really good examples that were produced by that. And you throw some rugby in there too, right? And probably a good amount of time in chapel. But basically, that's the curriculum. So this is always the question: is what are we going to do? There's this idea of Socratic seminar, great books, liberal arts, right? But the historical answer is that's what it was in almost living memory. That's what it was, right? As recently as the 1920s and 30s in some places. That's the impractical answer, and then people are going to fight about it, about what counts as classical education. There is no authority to adjudicate that question. There are lots of people proposing oughts. What I've done with my scholarship is try to demonstrate was, and hopefully we can look at that. I'm not advocating 3 hours of Latin and 2 of math with some sports in chapel, but I do think that was the answer. The practical answer is I've spoken to a lot of heads of schools. They've had this problem, especially since 2020. A lot of the growth in classical education is not from parents and students who want it, but from parents and students who are running away from something else. And they come and they show up at the classical school and they like that they don't have these things, but then they say, but where's the football team? Where are the AP classes? Why are they spending so much time reading all these old books? Like, I thought you read what we were. So that's a big problem. And what I've seen is there's a lot of places have salon. They're trying to do these sorts of humanistic things and demonstrate that we're different. So a PTA meeting might be, let's read a book and meet and talk about the book and model what's going on in the classroom with the children, with the parents. People have had success with that. The head of school at Great Hearts Irving, who I've gotten to know pretty well, she says the way she does it on New Parents Night, which I experienced last year because we're relatively new to Irving, is she says at the school, we cook and serve steaks. We're a steakhouse. We don't serve hamburgers. You want hamburgers, go somewhere else. That's what we do. We're a steakhouse. And I think that is really helpful to just be like very open and and it gets people the right kind of idea. They famously, you can't talk about Spider-Man at that school. It doesn't mean Spider-Man's bad. That's just not what we do here. So I think that can be helpful, but you have to find a way to do it that's inoffensive. And also I think modern, because it is very unusual. It's not mainstream. It's growing, but it's not mainstream. And people don't have a frame of reference to understand what's going on. So demonstration is very helpful in those contexts.
Yeah, and in terms of avoiding the last pitfall Dr. Snell mentioned, there's always the problem of overcompensation potentially. And so you have the look to the right students, but that's not the aim of the school. The aim of the school is to teach people how to think. And so without any knowledge, you can't think well. But if all you're doing is reciting what you've learned rote, then you're not going to be able to think either. So the goal is really to think. But one of the issues that we face is that so much of education used to take place outside the context of school. So there was a canon. It was a flexible canon, but it changed over time in terms of what people favored. But if you read David Copperfield, say, right, and the way in which the characters formulated, of course, it's partly autobiographical about Dickens himself, right, just living off of Don Quixote and Robinson Crusoe, so on and so forth. All of the books that you were just expected to read if you were precocious and were going to be a good reader. Now we're trying to do this in school because if we don't have kids read books in school, then they're not going to do anything, in terms of reading. So I think that it's important to formulate a curriculum that gets students to where they need to be. And one thing that we've seen in the programs that we've run is that students really appreciate it when they know that they've moved from point A to point Z and that it made sense that they were moving along. With regard to the essay of Rupture and Reconstruction, that one of the problems that we have is there isn't really going back. Like you can't really go back to grandma's kitchen, so now we have to, but making a bunch of code books isn't really a good way to deal with it either. So what do? Well, we have to figure out a way to now be essentially self-consciously explain why we do what we do and why we want to do what we do. And we have to balance two things that are quite difficult to have both at the same time. There's the intellectual element and the spiritual element, and both need to be present. And they both need to be in service of the humanity, the real human being, like what Dr. Snell is saying, like me, I, you, in real conversation. And that's based on love. That's based on the sense that we're doing this for humane purposes. We're not doing it for power. We're not doing it to not be losers. We're not doing it to whatever the case may be. We're doing it to be good human beings. That point has to be driven home every step of the way in terms of the design of the curriculum and in terms of what parents are being told. You're here to be a good human being. If you do that, all other considerations become secondary and everything else will fall into place.
Any closing remarks? We have 1 more minute for a question. Final question.
Okay. This is kind of a question for the whole panel, but basing it off specifically Rabbi Rocklin's claim that the poetic foundation for education is necessary. I'm a senior at the University of Dallas, and over my 4 years of education here, I've learned a lot. But I think something that I really determined philosophically, at least, is this idea of like a mode of poetic interpretation for a student, where in the poetic mind and so its interconnectedness and creation takes a particular, like a flower, and then abstracts it into a universal concept, and then can apply it in other areas in particulars. I guess my question is, do you agree with this definition? And if so, how does this idea relate to your idea that the poetic foundation is necessary for classical education?
You know, Shelley's contention that poets are the legislators of the world is possibly true. We could dispute that forever. I think it's just because in the interest of time, I think that I know the romantic tendency can be devastating and awful in where it leads, but that doesn't mean that it was entirely wrong. It was partially very much correct in reacting against what it reacted against in the context of the Enlightenment. Kids need an appreciation of beauty and wonder, and they need a drive that's going to get them to want to do good things throughout their lives, and they need to start ideally from a young age. So thankfully, children's literature was invented in, say, the 19th century, roughly. I mean, there's older versions of tales, but we have to give our kids we have to give our kids a poetic foundation and goodness from a young age. A lot of what we're dealing with the modern nihilism that Dr. Snell is describing is, I think part of the cure to it is goodness that comes in poetry and a desire to combat the dark and bitter responses to life, which have led to mass anxiety, as Jonathan Haidt and so many others have described. We need to combat this by giving our kids a sense of the richness of the goodness that it is to be human, the goodness that is existence from a very young age, so that they're inoculated against anxiety to the greatest extent possible by not being coddled, but by having a full sense of what life is. And that's only possible through poetry, beginning at a young age. I hope that's a sufficient answer in the short amount of time that we have.
Well, let's thank our panelists. Thanks to the audience. Questions?
Were you making the face about Shelley or?